Democrats are bereft of leadership.
There's no messaging from the Democratic Party.
Is there anyone leading the charge now, leading them out of the woods?
The people who are in charge are not up to the task. They are lost.
Democrats have no mojo, no power, and no unifying leader to look for a fresh start. Not my words. Those are the words of a Time magazine cover story featuring one word, lost, to describe the Democratic Party. Welcome to the Sanity Podcast. Dave Briggs and Allison Camerata here, both former CNN and Fox News anchors, approaching every story with that perspective. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. Those words I read earlier are, again, not mine. Those are Charlotte Alter's. She is a senior correspondent at Time magazine covering politics. Also, she's the author of The Ones We've Been Waiting For, How a New Generation of Leaders Will Transform America, which is really timely given this conversation. Charlotte, great to have you here. Thanks for coming on the program. What was the reaction to your piece about the state of the party?
Thanks so much for having me. I think it's pretty fair to say that for the last 6 months since Trump was elected and since Harris lost, the party has really been in a state of they're doing a big rethink. They're licking their wounds. They're trying to regroup and trying to figure out what's next. So listen, my piece did not create a lot of backlash because I think people understood that it was right.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting in your piece, Charlotte, where you said that the Democrats don't want to call it an autopsy, this soul searching that they're doing, this trying to find their identity. They don't want to call it an autopsy because they don't want to give the impression that they died during the last election. But is there some consensus that they have about what went wrong?
You know, unfortunately for them, there's not. There are sort of several different competing ideas and theories of the case. I think the one thing that everyone agrees on is that Joe Biden had no business running for president again. But I think it's impossible to separate Democrats' total failure in the last election from the sheer oldness of Joe Biden. I mean, his policies were unpopular, but even aside from his unpopular policies, which, by the way, I do think that a more competent, younger, energetic, if it had been President Pete Buttigieg with Joe Biden's policies, I think he would have had a better shot of selling that to the American people. He could have said, listen, we did the biggest investment in climate change, mitigation in a generation. We, reduced student debt for tens of thousands of people. And a President Buttigieg or a President Cory Booker or somebody who had the ability to actually go out there and talk and sell something could have convinced the American people that actually he was doing something. But Joe Biden was too old.
You seem to be not excusing, but Kamala Harris was the one who did nothing to sell Biden accomplishments, nothing to sell the strength of the economy, which by just about every metric was at an all-time high, was on fire compared to the entire developed world. Do you blame Kamala Harris for not selling those policies and their effectiveness?
So here's what I would say about that. Certainly, I think Kamala Harris made some big mistakes last cycle, and I'm not defending her. I do think that she was also put in an impossible situation, because if she had had 2 years to run for president, if Biden after 2022 had said, you know what, I'm not running again, I'm going to keep my promise to the American people and pass the torch to the next generation, and Harris had a long runway to make her case to the American people, maybe she would have won the primary, maybe she wouldn't have, but she would have, at least had the chance to separate herself from Joe Biden. But with 100 days, she did not have the space to maneuver and to say, Biden did this, I'm going to do that. Here's the ways that I'm different from my current boss, who is the president of the United States. So listen, I do think that she made some strategic mistakes, but nobody that I spoke to for this story said anything like, this one mistake that Harris made cost her the election. It wasn't like a Hillary Clinton 2016 thing where it's like, oh, she didn't go to Wisconsin. I think there is some broad agreement in the Democratic Party that the mistake, the fatal error that caused this was Joe Biden deciding to run for president again and staying in the race for so long that no other credible Democrat could come forward and run for president.
I mean, it's funny that now they're all in agreement and unanimous about that when beforehand, everybody was supporting President Biden. Like that in itself should be, exhibit A of what went wrong. And so, Charlotte, from your reporting, is there anyone leading the charge now, leading them out of the woods? Is there some leader that behind the scenes is emerging?
It's a great question, Allison, and it's the thing that everybody wants to know. And the answer is no. There is not, after I wrote this story, everybody came up to me and said, okay, well, who's going to be the nominee in 2028? And the truth is that person has not yet emerged, but also it's way too early for that person to emerge. If you think about the Democrats in 2005, after they were licking their wounds after George W. Bush was just reelected, right? They were in a very similar place. They were in the wilderness. They were in a funk. They had nobody. They were in the dumps, right? Barack Obama was not on anybody's mind at that point. I mean, he'd given a speech at the DNC, but if you'd said in 2005, Barack Obama's going to win the 2008 presidential election, people would have been like, who? Barack Obama? Who's that? So I do think that we do need a little bit of a reframe in terms of like, as I say in the story, every transformative political figure in American history has come out of a moment just like this one. So just because that person hasn't emerged yet, 6 months after this embarrassing defeat, doesn't mean the Democrats are screwed for 2028. Think about it. After Obama was elected in 2012, do you think anybody would have said, oh, Donald Trump's going to be our next president of the United States? It sometimes takes time for these parties to kind of regroup and for people to emerge from the woodwork.
You can bet on this, actually, right now. Kalshi has the odds. Gavin Newsom's the leader, followed by AOC and Pete Buttigieg. I would just throw in a few other names that I think Wes Moore is really one to watch. Gretchen Whitmer. Some like to talk about Stephen A. Smith. I don't. I guess I give that a little credence because it's interesting. Pick one. One of those names you think this is my favorite parlor game. Allison gets annoyed at this often. Pick one of those people you think could emerge.
Yeah. So, okay, you're asking me to pick one. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick two, because I think that and this frankly is like one of the main theses of it's one of the main points of my book, right? Is that essentially for the next generation of Democrats, there's two camps or two poles. There's the kind of Bernie Sanders movement politics, further left, more populist wing of the party. And I think AOC is the obvious standard bearer for that. And then there's the Barack Obama, slightly more kind of technocratic, more moderate, more what people would call practical wing of the party. And I think that Pete Buttigieg is emerging as a pretty obvious standard bearer for that.
So this would seem to be a moment that Democrats could seize on, because President Trump has reneged or not fulfilled many campaign promises. ICE is arresting all sorts of people that are not criminals. The economy has not been fixed magically. He said there'd be peace in the Middle East. He said there'd be peace in Ukraine immediately. None of that has happened. And for the people who believed him that he didn't want to be embroiled in any, overseas wars, well, now we've bombed Iran. So any reporting or any background on if Democrats can harness this in any way?
I think so far we can all agree that the Democratic response to this has been somewhat underwhelming. However, we also have to think, okay, like big picture, is a strongly worded statement 2 hours after a news event. Is that like the thing that moves elections? Probably not. The real thing that moves elections are movements, right? And I do think that what we have seen since Trump was elected is a determined and persistent anti-Trump movement that is slowly building greater and greater numbers. I mean, we saw in the hands-off protests in April, we saw a couple million people come into the streets just recently for the No Kings protest, the same day as Trump's military parade. We saw roughly 5 million people come into the streets. They're coming back again in July. July 17th is the next scheduled nationwide protest against Trump. These protests right now, which by the way have been incredibly disciplined, incredibly peaceful and incredibly disciplined. Not the anti-ICE protests in LA. I'm talking about these very specific ones that have been organized by Move On and Indivisible and some of these groups that have been really conscious about trying to build movement opposition to Trump in a disciplined way. It feels more determined. It feels less like people are there to have fun and more like people are there because they're pretty terrified about what's happening in this country.
Yeah, it's a tough spot for Democrats. We don't know the truth yet. We don't know if they even destroyed the uranium. We don't know if Iran's going to retaliate, how they're going to retaliate. Look, it goes without saying, if there are terrorist attacks on U.S. forces in the United States, Democrats will certainly find their voice. But the No Kings protest, to my knowledge, had no fingerprint of congressional Democrats and is anti-Trump a message that Democrats can rally around. It doesn't seem like one that can win elections.
I mean, it did win the 2020 election and it won the 2018 election. I think, and this is kind of what I'm going back to about Joe Biden's oldness, right? Because I do think that what we saw in the first Trump term is that anti-Trump does win elections for Democrats, but not when the person on the top of the ticket seems like they're about to die on national television, So I just think that like there's that there are.
My point is, Charlotte, that doesn't. There's no policy. There's no messaging from the Democratic Party. If someone were to ask you today, what policies, what's the message of the Democratic Party, what would you say?
It's a great question, and it's why I wrote my piece. They are lost. They do not have a unified message aside from resisting whatever Trump's doing. There are some people who are trying to build one. I think that they are trying to unite around messages around corruption. They're trying to unite around messages of sort of, trying to pushing back on some of these ICE arrests of people who don't have criminal records. They're trying to, I think the No Kings protest was about trying to, put the focus back on the ways that Trump is violating the Constitution. But you're right. Congressional Democrats are bereft of leadership. They are bereft of a message. And I think that's one of the big problems they have. I just would like to also add that many of these protests that I've been talking about are also against congressional Democratic leadership. They do not like Chuck Schumer right now. They are not happy with Leader Jeffries right now. So these protests are not sort of rallying around the Democratic flag in terms of like supporting the specific people who are in Democratic leadership. I think there is a lot of understanding among rank and file Democrats that there is a real leadership problem and that the people who are in charge are not up to the task.
Charlotte, there were so many interesting little nuggets in your article. And one of them was you do find a Democrat, a Massachusetts congressman. Is it Auchincloss?
Auchincloss.
Okay. And until I read his quote to you, I had forgotten what ideas sound like because there have been so few new ideas out there that I thought ideas were just like, well, save Social Security. That's the idea. Yes. And obviously preserve the Constitution. That one resonates with me. And so I thought that was it. And then here he comes and he's like, yeah, I have some ideas. And he spelled out to you, give free one-on-one tutoring to the kids who were left behind during COVID-19, subsidize community health clinics, hold social media companies accountable for the way they're damaging our kids. I was like, oh, that is what new ideas sound like.
Yes.
He's just, that's just one voice. And so like, there's no, consensus around all those.
So yes. And to be honest with you, Allison, it was it was frustrating to me reporting the story because I talked to dozens of Democrats, and every person I talked to, I would say, I would ask the question that you all are asking me right now. I'd say, what ideas should the Democratic Party stand for? And they would tell me things. They would say, we need to protect Social Security. We need to protect the Constitution. We need to protect Medicaid. And I was like, okay, sure. But like, I've heard those before, that's not a new idea. And they would what was interesting to me as I was reporting it is that people would repeat these ideas to me like as if they were new. And I was like, no, I know what Social Security is. Like, Democrats have been running on protecting Social Security for 50 years. Like, don't pretend as if that is some kind of inspiring new concept, right? Like, do you have anything else that maybe the American people would like to hear about? And it was honestly disappointing because, and Representative Auchincloss said this in our interview, which I think is in the piece, that a decade of fighting MAGA and a decade of opposing Donald Trump has really depleted a lot of the kind of intellectual dynamism from the Democrats because they don't have the time or energy or space to think of any new ideas when they're constantly responding to whatever the latest thing that Trump is doing.
That is a very interesting point. And one of their mysteries is what happened with young men, because young men really helped swing this election towards Trump. And there's a lot of talk about Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn and how Democrats have no answer to that. What happened with young men and how, if anything, what, if anything, do Democrats do to fix that?
Okay. I actually have a theory on this. Okay. So I think that when Trump was elected in 2016, Democrats and liberals and progressives were so appalled that somebody like Trump, who had said racist things, who had all of these credible allegations of sexual assault, who had all of these kind of problems, that somebody like him could be elected president of the United States. And I think that the social the waves of social justice movements that happened during that time were all a reaction to Trump being president. So Me Too, the George Floyd protests, all of the sort of reckonings around racial justice, all of the reckonings around gender in our society were all a kind of almost like societal chemotherapy to try to attack what progressives perceived to be the cancer of Donald Trump. And that's essentially what people would now call wokeness, right? Like, that's what wokeness was. Like, I think that during that time, there was almost like progressives and liberals and people who are in the sort of democratic world were trying to purge our society of sexism and racism because they could not get rid of Donald Trump. And I think that social movement clearly was very successful in a lot of ways and also has triggered a real backlash, because I think there's a generation of young men who think that Democrats and progressives and liberals are talking about everybody but them because they don't see themselves in their worldview at all.
But how did Democrats lose on an issue like transgender sports? It seems like such an easy one for them, and they just can't figure it out. Something that it's probably about a dozen to 20 cases across the United States, and yet it was a pivotal message in this election.
That's an issue that Republicans are pushing. Democrats do not want to talk about trans kids.
Right, but why
Republicans
not?
are the ones. This is one of the other things that I think Democrats are reckoning with right now. Is I think that there's a real rethinking of the role of advocacy groups in their coalition, because over the last decade, what advocacy groups have done is essentially hold elected Democrats' feet to the fire if they're not with them on one issue or another. And what that has meant for a lot of Democrats is that by saying the right thing that will appease all of these different advocacy groups, they are not really saying what their voters want to hear.
Really interesting. Charlotte, my last question for you is this 30,000-foot question about the Democrats, which is you've spelled out perfectly the kind of two choices, if that's a real paradigm, between the more progressive and the more centrist or the more technocratic. And haven't we learned over and over that this country is basically center right? And that, I mean, progressives don't generally win presidential elections. Bill Clinton wins. Barack Obama wins. Donald Trump won the popular vote, the House and the Senate. And he was such a flawed, not even candidate, I mean, human being. I mean, he was a convicted criminal. And so why don't Democrats see that as, oh, people in this country are pretty center or center right at the end of the day?
I think they are seeing that. And that's one of the reckonings that they are coming to terms with. And that's why I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see a lot more moderate Democrats winning primaries in 2018. And, you know, and I think that in 2026, and God, it's been a long decade.
It's been a long decade.
But Allison, you're totally right. And this is one thing this is a question that I ask sources a lot. I say, listen, if you look at the maps after the 2024 election, you see all of these bright red arrows moving to the right. Like, why would you run a progressive candidate in this environment? And that's a real thing that they're grappling with. And also, there is a cultural cross current here, because your question, which is totally valid, is rooted in an idea of politics that is ultimately based in policy and ideology. It's like, do you want Medicare for all, or do you want just private health insurance? Like it's ultimately based in the realities of policy. But what I think we're all seeing is that Americans are not really making their political decisions based on policy anymore. They're making their political decisions based on vibes and who they feel like gets them and represents them. And that's why you see now all of these candidates who, like, if you look at their policies, you're like, what? But there's something about them. They're able to communicate. They're able to use social media in a way that reaches people. They're going on the right podcast. They're going viral. They're able to get to people and have people feel like they relate to them. And what we've seen on the Democratic side is that most of the Democrats who are able to do that are the more progressive ones. So that's part of their problem right now.
I highly recommend everyone read a Washington Post article a couple of weeks ago about Abigail Spanberger, Mikey Sherrill, and Alyssa Slotkin. As they say, three centrist women with national security backgrounds. To me, that is the entire path forward, but that means Democrats won't take that path. So on the flip side, what we haven't talked about is Republicans, because if and when Trump leaves the stage, I can't help but wonder, what policies do they stand for? I mean, immigration, sure, transgender sports, but minus Trump, what did they rally around?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that if I was a Republican, I would be very worried about, because what we've seen over the last decade is that like Trump is not Trump, and that, sure, there have been people who've won elections by wrapping themselves in the MAGA flag, but Trump has something that deeply connects with millions of American people who otherwise do not care about politics. And this is something that I have to say. And I remind myself this over and over again. The smarter you are about politics, the dumber you are about politics. Because if your worldview is totally rooted in spreadsheets and data points and polling and well, this particular policy would cost this much of the budget and like blah, blah, like then you're missing the forest for the trees and you're not seeing the world the way people who decide elections see the world. We know now that the people who decide elections, particularly presidential elections, are often low information voters. They're often infrequent voters, and often their political identity does not plot neatly across an ideological spectrum. So you might have people who, for example, like support Medicare for all, but also want to increase immigration enforcement. Or people who, oppose the war in Iran, but, also oppose transgender rights. So those are the people who decide presidential elections. And most of the country is like that.
But it's so insightful, Charlotte. I think that you make such a great point. It's personality over policy, and for sure. And, that basically Democrats need to figure out if they're comfortable harnessing that.
I mean, like, I call this the vibes theory of politics. Vibes count so much more than we in the political media really think it does. And vibes are also very difficult to measure. One thing that, we were talking about Gavin Newsom earlier. Gavin Newsom has a vibe problem. Gavin Newsom is somebody who looks great on paper, sounds very compelling, but if I was on his team, I would have some pretty big questions about the vibe. What is the vibe that he's projecting to the American people? I think the vibe is like an X factor that we've seen in the last couple of years. Like that the importance of that X factor gets higher and higher and higher.
Charlotte, we ask every one of our guests, journalist or newsmaker, at the end of our show for a dose of sanity. And I think it's particularly good to ask you, since you have 2 children, 3 and under. So, what are you doing nowadays to stay sane?
Wow, that's such a good question. Let me think for a second, because I'm like, am I sane?
This really is telling.
Sane? Okay, one thing I like to do to stay sane is I like to cook. And cooking is something where if you have small children, I can make my husband be like, you are on the kids while I cook dinner. Sorry, it took an hour and a half. Oh no, but I actually do. I love to cook. So it's like my little trick to get more me time while I'm ostensibly doing something that's like productive.
Love that. I love that, because I remember my me time was like hiding in the bathroom and occasionally showering, but you're actually producing something and maybe drinking wine during it, I hope.
Okay. Well, Allison, I mean, let's be honest. That is also my me time, but I didn't want to say in this podcast that I just like sit on the toilet on my phone.
It's so true. It's so true. It's not glamorous, but it's true. But
I did censor myself. See, I don't have the vibe. I don't know.
But that's the vibe, though. Be real. That's it. You got it. Charlotte Alter, Time senior correspondent. Check out her book, The Ones We've Been Waiting For: How a New Generation of Leaders Will Transform America. Democrats are waiting for those leaders. Thanks so much for being with us here on Sanity. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.